Welcome to today's program from the Commonwealth Club of California. You can find more of our online programs at commonwealthclub.org/online. I want to express our appreciation for their generous support for today's program to Gilead and Comcast. Thank you very much for making this possible. I'm John Zipperer, the club's Vice President of Media and Editorial, and your co-host for today's program. We're going to be doing a discussion of the iconic AIDS Memorial Quilt. We're going to get into its past, present, and its future. Now, my co-host is a member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors, and she is the producer and host of The Michelle Meow Show. She is, of course, Michelle Meow. Michelle, good to see you again.
Oh, I'm so excited, John. It's always great to see you, and of course, excited for this incredible talk. So thank you to AIDS 2020 for partnering with us and putting this together. And now, I'm very excited and pleased to introduce our panelists. We have John Cunningham, who has been the executive director of the National AIDS Memorial since 2009. John has held numerous nonprofit board-level positions, having served as president of the Castro Community Business Alliance, board chair of the New Hampshire AIDS Foundation, vice president of Folsom Street Events, and also board member of Positive Resource Center. He currently resides in Oakland with his husband and dog Billy. Mike Smith is the co-founder of the NAMES Project AIDS Memorial Quilt and served as managing director from 1987 to 1989. During his tenure, the quilt grew from an idea to more than 18,000 memorial panels in 20 countries. In 1989, the organization was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and the film about the quilt, Common Threads, received the Academy Award for Best Documentary. He returned to the NAMES Project in 1996 to produce the last full-scale display of the quilt in Washington, D.C. that year. Mike recently rejoined the quilt team as a consultant to the National AIDS Memorial, the new stewards of the quilt. And last but not least, we have Gert McMullen, which I really shouldn't read her bio because that would just give the entire story. But Gert is the quilt conservator and production manager at National AIDS Memorial. And so welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this very special program, and I should say special day. We're all together, virtually at least. Well, let's start with the quilt. Really, the AIDS Memorial Quilt was founded by the NAMES Project back in 1985, I think technically, and it was during a candlelight march, remembering the assassination of Supervisor Harvey Milk and Mayor Moscone, that activist Cleve Jones he and some others had written names on these signs of those that we lost to HIV/AIDS, and those signs would then be taped to the San Francisco Federal Building. And he looks up at all of these signs posted at the building, and it reminded him of a patchwork quilt, and so inspired. And the NAMES Project was born. I mentioned earlier in introducing you that Mike and Gert, you're both part of the founding of the quilt. But we'll start with Gert, because the of offering and lending your talent to actually to sew the panels together is such an incredible and special story. So let's get started with you and your personal story in being a part of the formation of the quilt.
Well, in 1987, I was kind of losing my mind. So many of my friends were dying, and I was searching out some place to help. And somebody told me to call Cleve Jones. I did that, and then 6 weeks later, there was the first meeting at the Women's Building on 16th Street, and that's where I met Mike Smith. I brought 2 panels in that I'd already sewn up to give to him, and which were tough having to leave them with him because I didn't know who he was. But that's where I began, and then I just, then Mike and Cleve found a spot in the Castro, and they called us up, and we had another meeting down there. And that's how I began.
Gert, there are a lot of people who see things happen and don't become involved, and even far fewer who become involved but don't stay with it for a long time. If you would, I know this gets personal, but I mean, what made you be someone who decided I have to be a part of this?
Well, I had been going to Shanti, helping at Shanti, and then helping with and going to hospitals and all. And I just needed some place that I could be around people who hurt like I did. Um, I don't know if you can even imagine being in a room with 300 people and being told that, in 5 years they'll all be dead. That's how my life was looking. I mean, everybody I knew was dying and didn't know what it was. And I was losing my mind. I needed a place that I could be around people who hurt and that I could talk about it. Nobody wanted to talk about them. They just, those guys died, don't talk about it. And I've always been the type that kind of jumps into things. And when I'm the most afraid of it, I jump into the center of it. And that's kind of what I did. But it was mainly that I was, when I met Mike and some other people, I could tell that they felt the same way. I wasn't alone anymore. There was somebody else that felt like me. And that was really comforting to me. And why I stayed for forever for all these years is that it's still the same thing. It's just comforting to me. I need it. It gets me through my life every day.
At the time, there was such stigma. There were not a. It was such a hard time. I think Gert, in talking to you, you had mentioned is the darkest era in the history of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And I think that it's super important to describe that, to describe the fact that the quilt, the memorial, the conference, and all these things that would end up being what it is today was a way to respond to the stigma, a way to respond to the government ignoring, people's lives, and people not even being memorialized after passing away. That was during a time when there weren't even funerals held.
Yeah. For me, it was a lot about anger, too. I mean, I was just so angry. And I went on that march with Cleve at the Federal Building. I put Roger's name up there. But I was just so angry that nobody was doing anything and nobody seemed to care. And they were just letting my friends die. And and I finally found some people that I could share that with and my anger and all. They felt the same way.
Mike, you want to add something to that?
Well, the mid '80s were such a dark time in the Castro. In the 10-block radius of Castro and Market, 1,000 men had already died, and another 2,000 were sick and being taken care of by friends and neighbors and lovers. But it still wasn't public. You'd walk out on the street and you'd pass people who you knew you were probably never going to see again. You'd be saying hello, but what you were really saying was goodbye. But the community hadn't acknowledged that grief. And when we first started making the quilt panels, the panels are 3 feet by 6 feet, the size of a grave. And that was done on purpose because for that first display in Washington, D.C. in October of '87, we wanted to show the world how much space these people would take up if they could have been at that march. There was, as Gert said, a lot of anger. A lot of us felt like every one of the 300 people in the room that Gert talks about, we were all going to die. And we were going to die alone and forgotten, ignored by our government, and swept under the rug. And the quilt, as much as it's as beautiful as it is when you look at it now, it was a desperate cry for help. It was a people that were desperate to be heard. And, when Cleve first looked up at the building and said the word quilt, you think of your grandmother taking care of you when you're sick. You think of chicken soup. You think of warm children cuddled in a bed. And none of those were the metaphors that were being used at that time to talk about AIDS. It was clearly, you have AIDS, we don't, it's your problem. And the quilt, I think, really broke through that. It spoke to Middle America. And it also created a hub in the Castro where people could come and gather and cry on a shoulder when they just got a test result, or come in right after a friend had died. And Gert would sit there and talk with them and talk to them about how to make a panel, or just spend quality time just listening. There really wasn't anything like it. We became a de facto community center in the heart of the epidemic.
Did you know that at the very beginning this would be sending messages both to the general public as well as the LGBTQ community? Or was the original intent thinking that, well, this is an internal thing expressing our grief?
We had always hoped that the quilt would break through to Middle America and open a dialogue. I think that summer, though, was very difficult. We were making panels by the dozens. We had an entire workshop filled with people coming in after work to create memorial panels for loved ones. And we were getting panels from around the country, but they were coming from New York and LA and Chicago and the gay hubs. And by the end of the summer, we had about half of what we thought we needed to really make a statement. And then, something really, really remarkable happened. We had put out a flyer in the mail to grief counselors across the country and asked them to share it with people and said, if you wanted to make a panel, send it to us by September 15th and we'll get it sewn in and onto the mall a month later, which I really regret now. But, it just about killed us. We had, in those few days around September 15th, we had 800 pieces of overnight mail. Wow. Packages from mothers, mostly, in every state. Families that had lost a son who had probably died in one of the urban centers and had left home. Families that couldn't share their grief with their pastor, couldn't tell anyone in their community what their son had died of. And in that loneliness, they made a quilt panel and they sent it to a bunch of gay men in the Castro.
Strangers.
How desperate do you have to be to do that? And it changed the world for us, because I think for the first time when that mail arrived, we realized we were not alone, that what we were going through in our neighborhood, we had allies all across the country. And when we got to the mall with the quilt, it spoke volumes. It wasn't just a gay memorial. It represented every state in the union and families from all across the country. And it was part of what broke it through and changed the dialogue around AIDS in the country.
Let's talk about, changing the dialogue. I think, it was within years of each other, the quilt and then the first AIDS International Conference and then the memorial. John, would love to hear when the memorial actually was born or founded and kind of what led to what led to to 1996, basically.
So, I think it's no coincidence that these two iconic memorials projects were created within years of each other, within miles of each other in San Francisco. San Francisco has long stood as as I like to say, the conscience touchstone of our nation. And as Mike and Gert have shared, there was such a sense of hopelessness at that time in the community. Individuals trying to figure out how to go on, so much loss and so much darkness that was happening. But on the other side of that, the other side of the coin, the community was so alive. The marches, people were showing up in so many different ways. However, it worked for them, whether they were caregiving or they were cooking or they were sewing, whatever it was, the community was alive and doing it. Memorials are about memories, and memories are about never forgetting. And so the National AIDS Memorial, or what was originally called the AIDS Memorial Grove, was conceived in 1988 by a group of individuals, much like the quilt. However, one was an activist tool and one was more of a contemplative memorial space, as I believe Mike likes to share. The activist tool goes out and does its work in teaching, and people get tired out there on the road, and they come back and they find a place of peace and serenity, which is now the National AIDS Memorial. I also think it speaks volumes about what was happening in our city at that time, that the city mothers and fathers and leadership under the mayor at the time was Mayor Agnos, gave 10.5 acres of Golden Gate Park to be formed organization, because they knew and they felt, because they were losing their staff, they were losing their neighbors. It was impacting the fabric of our community and the totality of our city. We were 10 years into the epidemic, and nearly 15,000 San Franciscans had already been lost to the epidemic. Those of us who picked up the BAR could remember thumbing page after page after page of obituaries that were, barely the size of a postage stamp. And so the work began, and it was a derelict site that was abandoned. And in the first 6 months, there were 60 dump truck loads taken out, and the work began to transform that landscape. And as I like to say, it not only was transforming the landscape, it was transforming the lives of the individuals that came to do the work, to pull the weeds. Just like the quilt, they were sewing panels. And as I like to say, the healing was happening on either side of the shovel. As Gert just said, she needed to be around people that were going through what she was going through. And I think that we all know that in life we have our journeys and our difficult times, and that's what the Grove was about as well. Many remember that Nancy Pelosi ran for Congress, taking Burton's seat. on an AIDS platform. And when she was sworn into Congress, you are always given the opportunity to address the speaker, and you're always told to be deferential and say, thank you, I'm just happy to be here, and thank you very much. And of course, she did not. Our Nancy Pelosi has never been deferential, and she stood and said, I'm here to give a voice to AIDS, and I will not stop, because I ask all of you, if you had lost 15,000 of your constituency, would you say this body is doing enough? And I think we all know the answer to that. So she had spent time coming to the Grove and doing work and seeing the power of what was going on, where people coming together and spending time in nature because there's so much healing. She wrote the Bill of Congress, and it was signed into law in 1996 by President Clinton. So those of us that are viewing here and that are San Franciscans, we should be so honored that through the work and the passion and the commitment of a community that created something out of nothing, that took the pain and despair and turned it into hope, and transformed a once derelict site into not only a national memorial, but an excellent Urban Landscape Award-winning site. And that's the power of what happens when you take grief and you take heartache and you channel it into doing something for the betterment of society. And the quilt stands for that, and the AIDS Memorial does as well.
John, how did the plan for the memorial site come together? How did they decide how it was to be used?
There were a number of different sites that were looked at and were considered. We settled on what is known as the de la Viaga Dell. And de la Viaga Dell was bequeathed to the city by Jose Vicente de la Viaga, who was a large Spanish land baron in San Francisco. And ironically, descendants of Jose's had lost an individual to the epidemic, to AIDS. And the site had fallen into a great disrepair because the economy in the city in those days was the economy in general, and our nation was suffering, and so the tax base was low, so the park system couldn't maintain it. And so there was a committee that was created and began the work. And what really happened was there was a charrette that was done for design. Those of you that visit the memorial, you'll see that there are all broken circles, which symbolizes the broken circles of life. Then we lose our friends and family. And they began a process of design. All of the color palettes that are planted within the memorial are all soft and muted and contemplative. And it's got waterfalls and creeks, and it is a dell, so it's a geographic bowl. So when you actually descend into the memorial, you indeed feel as though you're leaving the city and the feeling of the city. Over the last 28 years, over 250,000 volunteer hours have been dedicated to the space. When we began the work, in those days, anything that had the word AIDS in its name would have been siphoning money off from direct services. And so the organization made a strategic decision from its founding that it would not take public money. And we have stayed true to that because we never wanted money to be siphoned off and directed towards us that would have gone to research, direct care, housing, medical, and the like. So on the third Saturday of every month, we continue to have volunteer work days where the community gathers together. Unfortunately, those can't happen virtually because the impact, you can't pull a weed virtually. But we look forward to hopefully gathering again and re-engaging on that. So that's sort of how the memorial was created.
If you're joining us, we want you to be engaged. We want you to ask questions. And so please do. And John will ask these questions, be in the conversation with us. Mike, we mentioned that the first showing of the quilt was in D.C., and then throughout its years, it has traveled. And so I think, we'd love to share some of those stories of how it's traveled, where it's been, and maybe share also some stories of meeting folks or, relationships maybe that you didn't think that you would encounter that you did by being a part of this project. We'll start with Mike.
I think a lot of us felt like we were doing that first display in 1987 on the mall, and then we were going to go back to the rest of our lives, that for some reason the dam was going to open and the world was going to change and we wouldn't have to do this anymore. And it didn't work out that way. We had so many panels from around the country that for the next 2 years, we put together 2 different national tours, and poor Gert lived in a Winnebago and drove across America twice, all the way around for 2 years, basically. Visiting cities with a team of wonderful staff from the Names Project. All the men are dead now, and all the women are still going. uh, and uh, and in each Monday we'd drive to the next city. Tuesday was a bit of a day off. Wednesday you'd teach volunteers what to do. Thursday the walkways went out. Friday it opened to the public. It lasted through Sunday. You packed it back up and you got in the Winnebago and you moved to the next city. And Gert's most of Gert's friends in the world now are people she's met from all over the country from those tours. It was a life-changing experience for us, and it was a life-changing experience for the people we met in the middle of very dark times. Yeah, Gert, you want to?
Driving up to, when we left and then driving up to a city and seeing the hundreds of volunteers that were just so hungry for the quilt was such an incredible feeling. I can't even explain to you. I mean, the 4 months that we were gone was probably the best 4 months of my life, except for the inaugural display in '87. It was the most memorable time I'll ever have. And the 6 people that joined me during that time, I will forever love. And we were all so vastly different, vastly. I would do anything for them. I mean, it really cemented our relationship. But some of the mothers, parents, lovers, I mean, all the people that we met on the tour, it was just incredible. We met, I mean, it was really pretty incredible. I don't even know how to explain it. I have met mothers who have, after that, have flown in to see me in San Francisco and Atlanta after years and years later, just because they wanted to thank me. And like Mike said, almost every single one of my friends is somebody that I'm really close with that I met in one of those 20 cities that we went to. Was an experience. And when we got back, but the great thing too was that I could tell the city had healed. When we came over that hill, you know, in the Winnebago and got out of there, it was just a different city than when I left. And there was just the real excitement, and I just loved it.
And we did those big outdoor displays all through the 80s and early 90s, the last one being in 96. And really in the intervening years, we don't do so many of the really big outdoor extravaganza displays, in part because the people who come to those are people who are coming on purpose because they already are part of and understand the epidemic. We want to be using the quilt in a little bit more of a guerrilla warfare kind of way. A display in an airport terminal where people get off the plane and are confronted with AIDS in the middle of their daily life. Displays in high schools and college campuses where young people who, you know, think they're immortal and are out right now not wearing masks, are confronted with mortality. Yep. And confronted with beauty and love in response to a community illness. And that's been our message then, and it works today as well, that when we're in these kind of medical crises, you respond with love and compassion and healing, and not with bigotry and fear. And that's the message the quilt has taken all over the country for 33 years.
Right.
Talk, if you would, a bit about that very first time in Washington in '87 when this was, you know, put out. What was, you said the people who tend to come to those things are the folks who already kind of know about it. Was that the first time? Was that who it was attracting? Were there Congress members who were there? I mean, who was coming there, and what was the impact for you and the others, you know, who worked on this?
Yeah, that display was specifically scheduled to be during the National March on Washington for Gay and Lesbian Rights on October 11th, 1987. Mm-hmm. And Gert and I and a bunch of people got out there at midnight in the dark and laying out walkways in the dark, not sure that they're going to line up and that when the sun comes up, there's going to be a quilt, but there was. And when the unfolding was at dawn, 7:11 in the morning on October 11th. And we had a few thousand people around the perimeter who came out at dawn to see it. It was predominantly, for that unfolding, it was predominantly panel makers and others who had flown in just to be there with us. But over the course of that day, that march attracted 500,000 people from all walks of life, LGBT from all across the country. And as they came up to the mall to the speeches at the far end, they literally had to walk almost through the quilt. And, you know, you'd have people out there rallying and cheering and making noise, and they would come up to the edge of the quilt and it would go amazingly silent. The reverence of the fabric was breathtaking, and people would stop their reverie and sort of pace themselves through it and were in tears by the end. And I think that was the visual image from that civil rights march. AIDS at that time defined that civil rights march. dozens, hundreds, thousands of AIDS organizations, community-based AIDS organizations all over the country started that day. Over the course of the winter of 87 and 88, nearly every AIDS organization you know of now that's community-based was formed. Because of the impact the quilt had that day and because of the energy that came off that rally with people going back to their communities charged up. It was amazing. Amazing.
I don't think we or anybody else knew what kind of impact we were going to have. At least we were laying down some quilt, and that was that. But then when the march started coming up, I remember, we thought they were going to walk. We thought they would not even notice it and walk on it. So I think, Mike, you were up in the front or something, and weren't they linked arms to keep people from off?
We were worried that people weren't going to even see it and step right onto it. So we had a little bit of a barricade, but we didn't really have to do it. The sea just kind of parted, and it was remarkable.
Yeah.
Nothing we ever expected.
Not least of all us, that it was the impact that we were going to have, and that we were going to steal the show. I mean, we were on every newspaper. We
were above the fold in every paper in the world the next day, and. For a lot of small town and middle America, their newspaper had not run a story about AIDS. They had not used the word AIDS in a newspaper story or on the local news. And for that one night and that next morning, AIDS was above the fold in every newspaper in every small town and on every evening news, local evening news in all sorts of small cities. And that had to have given hope to LGBT kids growing up, seeing themselves there. And it certainly gave hope to people living with HIV all over the country who felt like finally their country was paying attention.
So the Washington Post, they had their article, or the front page was "The Quilt That Woke Up America." And that's kind of what we did.
And there was a great cartoon the next day of Ronald Reagan, who of course hadn't used the word AIDS for years and dodged the issue repeatedly. Someone had sketched out a black and white cartoon in the paper showing the quilt laid out all across America and Ronald Reagan asleep under it in Washington, oblivious. It summed up the whole situation perfectly in one illustration.
Right. And then, like when you said, when we came back, we didn't know what I thought it was just going to be closed up, and then all the people that had gone there were calling you guys saying,
you were still working part-time at Macy's. You had to give
Macy's. You were going to save the world. I was going to go back to work.
You were going to go back to selling cosmetics at the Macy's.
Right. John, I think you wanted to add some things, but just like Mike had said, and the quilt changed America in a lot of ways, and you brought people affected by HIV/AIDS. You humanized, what was going on. But I also think that what I always love to talk about is just this shift, the change when you finally get federal recognition and people who were sick, who were dying and ignored, by leaders of their government. I'd love to talk about that shift when once you had leaders actually care, once we were able to bring humans together, what were some of the policy changes, or not even just from an attitude point of view, but like what started happening locally, statewide, federally. It just sounds like people were being held accountable and things had to change.
I think you're right. Out of the AIDS crisis and out of San Francisco as well, there are so many lessons that have been not only learned, but policies that have been changed. Remembering back to those dark days, you couldn't, if you were the partner of somebody that was ill at SF General or a hospital, you couldn't go in and see them. You couldn't spend time with them. You couldn't hold their hands. And those are some of the things that have changed. In addition, how drugs come to market. How the CDC looks at things. I don't want to draw these parallels, but I think that we would be remiss if we didn't touch on them. That, the thread that is pulled from one pandemic to another, the question I think that we need to look at is, have we learned the lessons? And have we forgotten them or set them on the shelf? And that's really what the power of the quilt is, and what the commitment that we have as the stewards to the future is, not only to teach and educate and inform the next generations as to what happened in the epidemic. But even more importantly, the quilt is perhaps the most powerful social justice teaching tool that was ever created. because it was an activist tool. It went out and it through, as you've said, Michelle, through humanizing, through making it real, through making it an individual, because when you look at those panels, you see a person. And it's much different than just a name. And so, our commitment is, and through the quilt is to take it back out to strategically targeted areas that are in need of this, because the quilt is also a miracle teacher in the sense that its creation as being something that is so iconic to our culture. It can enter communities where other things can't, and it can bring communities out and begin conversations. So, Jackson, Mississippi, highest infection rates in our country. The quilt needs to go there. It needs to pull that community out. It needs to start some conversations. But we're also working to ensure that we stay relevant into the next generation and leveraging technology. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge, your sponsor of this conversation today, Gilead, as well as Gilead, who helped to make sure that the quilt will be secured in perpetuity as our preservation partner. And we are committed to taking the quilt and transferring it into a technological sphere so that the quilt can actually go out technologically, virtually to the world. When we became the stewards, there are over 200,000 pieces of archival material that are in addition to the panel, that back up the panel, that are the letters from the mother, that are the war medals, that are the actual remains of the individual being memorialized. And we entered into a relationship with the Library of Congress, and all of those archival materials have been transferred to the custodianship of the library. We retain the rights to them, but we put them in the largest open source library in the world. And we are in the process of digitizing them all so they can then be linked to the quilt. So not only you can go to a quilt panel that's in high res and bring it up, but there will be an icon on that quilt panel that you can open up a folder and you can read the letters from the mothers and from the lovers and the newspaper articles and the commendation that the individual has. Because that's the future. Because we must keep it alive. We must not repeat the lessons of the mistakes of the past. And as Mike and Gert also know, we've been contacted by many in this current pandemic that have asked, how did you do this? Because we need to create panels for the individuals that died alone, just with the loving nurses at their side in COVID, as those young boys did in the early days of the epidemic as well.
Thank you so much for that. And that basically brings us, it's a great segue question. And the quilt is coming home to San Francisco after X amount of years. I'd mentioned that while reading Mike's bio. So what does that mean? What does it mean when the quilt is coming home after so many years? And I think coming from Atlanta, Mike.
Well, the quilt is coming home, but in my world, it's mostly Gert is coming home. She's lived and breathed the quilt for 33 years, and she moved to Atlanta when the quilt moved there years ago. And as you can see, has come back with it here and continuing in its next phase. Where the quilt is based isn't necessarily relevant. It's a library system. It's shelves and shelves of quilt that can be done like a check-in, check-out system that travel all over the world all the time. So the physicality of it isn't necessarily the crux of it, but the emotional heart of the quilt has always been here, where it started. This remains the community most responsive to a call for volunteers, for instance, where more panel makers are from here than other parts of the country. By coming back here and by having the resources of the National AIDS Memorial and being partnered with the Grove, it gives us an opportunity to re-envision how we do displays, what we do technologically, and it automatically comes with a core team of volunteers and community relations and community resources that are going to be able to catapult us into the next decade.
And then, Gert, you coming home, I guess we should mention it, that being the conservator for so many years and preserving, the quilt, and now we're in this pandemic. You continue, I think, to keep the spirit of the quilt alive, and being there for our community members. And I think it was John who had briefly mentioned it, but talk about how you're continuing, the work and what your support looks like here during this pandemic.
You mean with the mask?
That's
That's
right.
it.
I think John tells a story of why I started it better when I made the phone call to you. What do you-
Yeah, we had a board meeting, and one of our board members had informed us in the board meeting that he had tested positive to COVID, and this was in the very early days. And the board meeting ended, and I got a call from Gert, and she was broken down, and she said, "I don't know what I will do in this pandemic because I cannot be with individuals, I cannot touch them, I cannot hold them, I cannot lay in the hospital bed next to them and comfort them. I don't know what to do." And I said, "Well, I hear you, get some sleep and let's talk in the morning." And she called in the morning and she said, "I know how to sew. I can make masks." And so I'll turn it over to Gert, but that's how I got it.
So I was just remembering all of the nurses during the horrible years in the 80s and 90s and how they just would do anything for my friends. And I thought maybe I can help them in some small way. So I decided to I know how to sew. Who would have thought it would have come up again? It's another pandemic and I'm sewing. But I specifically wanted it to go to the nurses. I made them out of the fabric here that we have at the Names Project that was supposed to be for making panels. People have donated it for 20 odd years. And we have scraps all over the place. And so I thought, well, I should use that fabric, and I made them so that an N95 mask fits inside of that mask so that it protects them. I really didn't know if they would even want them or not, the nurses, if they would be that helpful to them. And I also said, I really shouldn't have had to been doing it. The government should have been supplying all these. But what little I can do for those nurses just has brought me so much joy. And so I continue to do that and bring them to St. Mary's and UCSF. And generally weekly, I'll bring them 100 or so each. And
you've inspired about a dozen of our longtime volunteers who sew just working from their home. This is something people could do despite sheltering in place. And we worked out a little drop-off system where they put them in the bin outside the warehouse, and Bert scoops them up, and we take them around in the back of my car, or we take them around to the hospitals.
Yeah, because they came up with at least 1,000. I would say that the other volunteers, they dropped them off, and then Mike would bring them in to the community center there. But and there's still other people are making them, and I know a lot of people around, and my friends are making them. So, but it really has been really heartwarming.
And when we first got media attention for Gert's,
it has got the
sewing quilt to sewing masks.
But the wonderful thing,
somebody got the impression that we were using fabric from the quilt, and Cleve and I got desperate
Repurposing it
from people saying they're cutting up the quilt to make masks.
yes.
No, we're not.
I do want to mention too, though, that John has allowed me to do that. I mean, when I said I wanted to, I could do it on my own time too, but he said, yes, do it. So it was really, I can't thank him enough for that, because it really helped me out a lot and helped the community out too.
And aside from the nurses, we've also supplied them to Acceptance Place, which is one of the Baker Place's recovery homes for LGBT individuals, as well as Bay Area services, community services, which supports a myriad of different congregant living groups, battered women, substance abuse. So, it's been really a powerful expression of love. And that's what the quilt is. That's what the Grove is. And I believe that at the center and the heart of what these two projects and others have created, comes out of a place of love. And I think if there's anything that our world right now needs, it's a little bit more love and compassion.
And flamingos.
Oh, there. Well, that's what the nurses said.
Flamingos.
What they loved the most about it was that it came from fabric that was supposed to be made. A panel was supposed to be made for, and they're so special that way. So they really just they grab them when I come and give them to them. So it's really been great.
That is great. We have a question from the audience, and this is getting to, particularly moving panels in the quilt that you've seen. We could, I'm sure, talk the entire hour just about that. So let me just ask maybe each one of you, what are one or two of them that you've seen that, I almost feel we're not going to get out of this without all of us sobbing, but one or two of them that were particularly moving for you, and why?
Well, I'll start. there's actually one right behind John. You can't see it very well right now, but it's for Scott Vincente, and it's a beautiful panel, and it's a partial nude. It's his back, and you can see his butt, and then there's these beautiful angel wings coming out of it. But the most beautiful part about that was when I opened it up, and I can usually tell when some, like a lover's made a panel or a mother, and I thought that was a lover's, and I started to read the letter, and I realized it was his mother that made that, a partial nude, and I had to call her and just tell her, if you made this, you are the best mother I have ever met. And I met a lot of mothers in my life. I said that you could go past that he was gay, past and in that you loved him that much to make that. And she said, well, he was a beautiful, beautiful boy. And it's just so, anyway, she ended up flying. I asked her if I could hold it for a while until I found enough beautiful ones to surround it in beauty. And then once I did, she actually flew out to meet me after she saw it. I can't remember what city she was from, but it's just an incredible panel.
Wow. Mike?
One of my favorite panels was turned in near the very beginning, when right at that moment when I think we all realized this wasn't going to be a summer project, that this was going to be our life's work, and that whatever plans we had were going to be put on hold because of the epidemic. It's a panel made to look like an Edward Gorey comic, with the duck walking in the rain holding the umbrella.
Oh, yeah.
And it just it's at the time I saw it, I thought it just summed up my life. It just says, last night I did not think that today it would be raining. And I think at that moment, that's so summed up the gay community and so much of the AIDS epidemic at the time, that one day we were gloriously happy and the next day it was raining.
Right.
John, how about you?
I'll actually use a little bit of a current day story. There on average, one panel still arrives about every day at the NAMES Project. So that's 365 some on a year. And what people are finding, or what we're finding, is that either there are nephews or nieces that they knew their uncle had passed away of AIDS, or they figured it out. But back in the day, the parents couldn't admit, and they wouldn't allow it to be admitted, and they wouldn't allow it to be talked about. And so they're now paying homage and honoring that perhaps that uncle that was lost. Or there's been other situations where after the final passing of a parent, and the family's going through the closets, and they're pulling things out, and they're closing down the home, and they come upon the panel that mom and dad made, and they made it for their son, but they put so much of their love into that panel, they could never let it go. And so those are some of what are coming our way, now. When the quilt was in Atlanta, there was an amazing project that was created, and it's called the Call My Name Project, because the internalized stigma as well within the African American Black community in those days was tough. And so they have been working with places of worship and faith to bring the community together and to honor those lives and to call those names once and for all, and to properly and appropriately honor them. So I think it's interesting to see what's coming now with the recognition that we've gotten over the last 6 or 8 months. We're seeing more and more come. So it's powerful.
I'll tell you one more story.
Yeah.
Yes.
There was a panel that was being made for Ted, and I know Mike will remember it. It had his mustache on the side, it's kind of the side of his face that said Ted. This guy had been working on this panel forever, and then he just didn't show up. And we kept waiting for him to show up, and we were, oh my God, what happened? And this happened a lot. We'd be not stuck with the panel, but the panel would be left, and the person would get sick and die. And so that's what we thought had happened. So Scott Lago and myself and another person, we decided we were going to finish it. The Moscone Center display was coming up. And so we finished it. And when we put it out on display, and as we're walking around, I noticed I was walking past, and I was going to show that panel to somebody, and I noticed that somebody was kneeling down beside it. And it was the guy who had made it, who had started it. And he was crying. And I said, you look familiar. And when he turned around, I went, oh my God. And he was just crying. And he said, I knew it couldn't be here. It wouldn't be here. I couldn't finish it. And who finished this, But it was so beautiful that he had shown up and he was still okay. He didn't look really good, but he had made it. So it was a really special moment.
John, one of our viewers actually, almost following up on what you were talking about, asks how would they go about submitting one today? Would that be sending, can you give them an address or a contact number, name and number or something?
So you can email me directly or Gert at jcunningham@aidsmemorial.org or gmcmullen@aidsmemorial.org, or you can go to our website at aidsmemorial.org, and it can give you everything you need to know about how to create a panel. Gert can act as an advisor and consultant and help you with that. So don't ever feel that if you don't work with that part of your brain, which I usually don't, Gert can help you get to that part of the brain and help you to be creative. We actually have been working with, she's working with Joyce Gordon at Gordon Gallery in Oakland, who lost her brother, to help her for a panel that may be displayed during the International AIDS Conference that will be here in San Francisco and Oakland, or virtually hosted by those two cities.
Thank you.
Back to me.
Yep.
Do we have more questions, comments? I love when we
Not at
get
the
them
moment.
from the audience. So keep them coming, please. Stay engaged with us. Be a part of the conversation.
Well, I have another one I wanted to throw in, and this is more just whenever we're talking about just how huge this thing is, and when you read about it, 54 tons, the number of train cars or whatever it took to move it across country. When you do, now you said you're not really doing the full layout anymore, but I mean, for the ones you do, how big, for the displays you do, how big do they tend to be, and how long does it take to set that up, and who does it, and how many people, all that? Just kind of get into some of the metrics, if you will, about this huge project.
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, it is 54 tons. It's 5 railway cars.
Wow.
But it's also small and personal. And we were able to do that years ago because each panel is 3 feet by 6 feet, and 8 of them get sewn together into a block that's 12 feet by 12 feet. And then the grommets are put in like shoelace holes all the way around, which means when we do a big display, what you're seeing is not one big quilt. What you're seeing is hundreds or dozens of these sections laced together to give that impression. So if somebody only has room in their, if the Jewish Community Center in Tuscaloosa, Alabama wants to do some HIV awareness work and wants a section of quilt, we have a database that we can get into and pull up what the right panel is. If they only have room for one section, we can make sure that the one that they get has references to Alabama and Jewish stars in that section, because we've cataloged it all as we've gone. So whether it's one section of quilt, which often happens, or even 5 or 6 in a gymnasium in a high school, we can make sure that that experience is personal and local for the people who are seeing it. We want them to see themselves when they look at the quilt.
Yep.
And it doesn't, and we had planned, we had a lot of plans until shelter in place came along. We had plans, we were going to do a big display in Golden Gate Park that's been put on hold. And that was going to be the same size and shape as that first display in 1987, about 2,000 sections of quilt. But it was going to be the most recent 2,000 panels, not the historic ones that are 33 years old, to help people understand where the epidemic is now and who the people are that we're losing now. And it's a shame that got put on hold, but someday we'll have a big display again in Golden Gate Park once we can all gather again together.
But having the entire thing out, I think that would take, all of the mall and the ellipse, probably.
Yeah, I think the days of a
no.
display like 96 are long gone.
Yeah,
In part because that display in 1996 was 3 days long. It was a mile long from the Washington Monument to the steps of the Capitol and all the way up under the trees on the mall. That took 11,512 volunteers.
Wow.
Right.
And you just, first of all, the quilt goes nowhere without volunteers. It sits on a shelf and is useless unless we have people to help us put together displays for shipping and coordinate those displays when they happen in communities. So we probably will never do the whole quilt again, but there are still opportunities to do some big displays once we can do that again.
If I may, and I won't give the date of when this is happening because we don't want people to come and congregate. But during the International AIDS Conference, which will be the 6th through the 10th, virtually, but San Francisco and Oakland, during that week, the quilt will be hanging from both Oakland and San Francisco's City Hall. So I invite anybody to go with your family and or your close safety cohort and experience it hanging from the front of those city halls and be able to really get the feel. And that is an opportunity for those two cities that have worked so hard, the local planning group, the International AIDS Society, to bring this conference to the Bay Area, to have a little bit of local satisfaction of something has been accomplished, and we've worked hard to get there.
That's perfect timing, John, because someone had just asked, one of our viewers had asked to get some more info about how the quilt and the AIDS 2020 conference would kind of be connected and be used.
There's a couple of other things that will be happening as well. Mike, did you want to?
I was just going to say that parts of the International AIDS Conference are open to the public. You can go to AIDS 2020 website and sign up to go through the Global Village and experience the virtual workshop we've created with quilt activity going on. And the same thing can be said for hundreds of community-based organizations who are going to be doing displays and works for the public in that portion of the conference.
And in addition to that, we will be on display in the arts and culture section of the local planning group, part of the Global Village. 2 weekends ago, we filmed with drones in Golden Gate Park, a traditional opening ceremony going from the lotus fold of the quilt with the 24 by 24 unfolding ceremony. And you'll be able to view that from the Global Village, as well as the 100 Faces of AIDS, which was done by Jim Wegler in the early days of the epidemic, will also be on display, as well as many others. And I know that Frameline, Michelle's been doing some work with Frameline. There will also be some great opportunities for stuff coming out of the conference there as well.
That's amazing. We've got about 12 minutes left, and I was saving, just this part of the conversation for the winding down moment. So, John, any other comments, questions from our audience?
Well, I wanted to ask about the 96 in Washington, because, of course, what did it mean to have the president and first lady come to it, especially after, Reagan and George Bush had been very AWOL on this whole topic? I think AWOL is being kind.
AWOL is being kind, yeah. It meant the world to us and to the AIDS community nationwide for a sitting president to actually come and walk among the quilt and talk with visitors and talk with people living with AIDS at that moment. I kind of felt like I thought there was going to be that breakthrough on that one day in 1987, and we waited 10 years to get to the point where our government showed they cared. And it was a remarkable moment. I got to spend some time with Cleve took Bill and I took Hillary, and we did a little walk through the quilt and all. And just as we were wrapping up, they were ducking her head to get her into the car, and she popped back out. They were on a little part of the mall where you were just a little higher than everything else. And she looked down the length of the mall and she said, everyone in this country knows somebody on this quilt. They just don't know that they do. And that's the work we have to do. Just a wonderful moment.
And they were shocked that a president hadn't been on it before. When they had no idea.
Well, it's a good segue again to my question for you, and each of you, please answer this. We talked about the history. We talked about what's happening now. We talked about ways that you're responding now, and the quilt is coming home. The National AIDS Memorial is the stewards, if you will, of the project. And you talked about, the panels that would be made for those we lose today. Even if you were not experiencing what was going on in the 80s, seeing the panels, reading about the quilt evokes emotions that you realize how horrible and tragic this really, really was in our history. And you say to yourself as, a neighbor, as a child of someone, as a friend of or a community member, that we never want this to happen again. And so I'd love for you to answer, what this means for the future, even if a lot of your work is also focused on our history. And we're not able to hold the International AIDS Conference, but it's happening virtually. And so the discussion, the work is necessary, and we continue on. So talk about that, the importance of continuing on. I'll start with Gert.
I'll start with Mike.
I'll start with Mike.
I think that I often say that the work that we did was not so much about the sewing as it was about setting an example and being a catalyst and showing people that in the midst of even the darkest times, you can find something to do. You know, the old Margaret Mead quote that a small group of committed individuals can change the world. In fact, they're the only thing that ever does. And, you know, I feel that very deeply, that so much of the work we're doing is creating space for other people to act, even if they don't have a medical skill set, for instance, right now. There are still things they can do. They can go to a food bank and stock groceries for people who are unemployed at this moment. There are always ways to respond, and I think we helped people see their own internal creativity, and that carries forward to this day and into the future.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always looked at the quilt like it is about the people on the quilt, but it's so much more about the people who made the quilt. Like Mike had said, it really became an emotional support kind of place. And I think that if people could get into that kind of headset for this pandemic, they could be useful. I mean, like I said, who would have thought that I could sew for this pandemic? And there's always something you can do to help your community. And that's, I think, what I needed. I just needed my community to grab me and hug me and say, you know, I'm hurting too, and I'll help you. It's kind of what we did.
You know, as our nation's only federally designated memorial to AIDS, you know, we hold dearly the responsibility to ensure that when we are all gone and we as the storytellers have moved on, and that there is a way that stories of the epidemic will live on. Because the greatest way that we can memorialize and remember and honor the lives lost, as well as those that worked so diligently and hard to bring about change, is to ensure that the story lives on. You know, and unfortunately, the AIDS crisis brought out both the worst and the best in humanity. You know, it was rooted in stigma and discrimination and prejudice and marginalization and otherisms. And unfortunately, there's a lot of those threads that we are living with today. But on the other side of that, it was also rooted in the greatest sense of love and compassion and community and activism and bringing about change and leaving a better world. So we've been at the National AIDS Memorial for the last number of years, and we're embarking on a new 5-year strategic planning process. Actually, the kickoff is immediately following this Zoom. And we've been working very hard to look at the future, and we are committed to ensuring that we honor those lives. And we've been investigating and exploring creating a center that will be rooted in social justice and human rights, and how those lessons are shared with future generations, because that's our obligation. There are only 44 memorials, and there are some memorials that must tell stories into the future. And usually those stories that they're telling are societal stories, where society responded or needed to respond or can learn from that. Because my objective as the executive director today is those that follow, that when a family comes to San Francisco with a young child and they visit somewhere, that child will be moved so that they will see where the injustices in society and humanity exist later in life. And they will get off the sidelines like so many did in the AIDS crisis and help to create a better world.
Wow. That's so powerful. And we're going to end the show because that was, no.
We're not going to top that.
Yeah, no. Well, we got about 5 minutes left. John, do you have a last question before I ask mine?
No, I want to hear your question.
Well, we started out by talking about Cleve Jones, who, the marching, a candlelight march, and written the names of people that he had lost. And anytime you actually talk to Cleve about how the epidemic impacted him, I mean, it's powerful, it's moving, and then at the same time, you could still hear the pain. And so I think that in closing, would love to ask you, what would Cleve say to a 23-year-old version of himself today with regards to where we're at in our movement? Yeah, that's a tough question. He'd probably say something similar to what John had said, but it would be something like, get off your effing ass. That's what it would be. We have work to do. Yeah.
Have that word in it, that's for sure. Cleve is alive and well and sheltered in place in Guerneville right now. So, I may call him up after this and say, what would you do? But, I know that he's an extraordinarily powerful speaker. And I know that he would find a way to reach into that person and bring out the best in them, and inspire them to do something to move the country forward on an issue like AIDS, or on any civil rights or social justice issue. He can be still very angry about those early days of HIV, and I think Gert and I have our moments where we're still angry too. It was a horrible time, and our government did not respond well. And Cleve has spent his life since the NAMES Project tackling lots of other social justice issues and working with hotel workers unions and others, giving rights and working on social justice issues in communities that really need that as well. He's been an inspiration to me my whole life. He certainly convinced me to put my life on hold and follow him all those years ago. And so I'm always deeply in debt to him for that. And a little angry at him too sometimes for that.
I would never attempt to speak for Cleve, words in Cleve's mouth. However, I can say that one of the greatest blessings that I've had over the last year and a half of navigating this journey forward was the opportunity to get closer to and get to know Cleve. And to know the angry activist, but also to know the soft and humanist that's there. And I think that if there's anything that I believe, one of the greatest things that Cleve leaves for all of us, but especially for young people, is that we can and they can, through stepping out of their own place of fear, bring about meaningful change. I believe that is one of the greatest gifts that he's given, whether it was when he stood on the steps at City Hall after the assassination, or whether it be standing on the stage for the quilt displays, or whatever it was. I think that his words inspire, and his actions inspire as well. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful for what he has done, and what Mike and Gert have also done. And I am so honored, and our organization is so humbled to continue in the work that was started by this trio to Rotary.
Do you want to say anything about Cleve will actually be on a Commonwealth Club program later this month?
And yes, that concludes our program. Thank you so much for joining us for this special talk. We have one coming up June 25th, and Cleve will be on there, in which that is the last of our Lavender series in partnership with San Francisco Pride, where we will be commemorating all of their honorees, and Cleve is one this year. So make sure you check it out. You can RSVP for that talk at commonwealthclub.org/MMS. And don't forget, we have a special program this Thursday coming up at noon, in which we'll discuss the Supreme Court decision and LGBTQ rights. And you can also RSVP at commonwealthclub.org/MMS. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us. Thank you to our sponsor, Gilead and Comcast. Thank you to AIDS 2020, or the International AIDS Conference. And lastly, thank you to the Commonwealth Club for, partnering and putting on a platform for all these conversations for social justice. We'll see you next time.